Hello, friends. This is Doug Scheibel, and welcome to the Premature Bible Institute. Just want to thank you so much for having been here the first 2 weeks. Like I said, the first week we talked about a little bit about who I am, some of the credibility that I have as a former church planter in Papua New Guinea. The second lesson dealt with what's the point of why am I teaching like this? What is it I'm trying to accomplish? And honestly, as a church planter among very remote language and ethnic groups, that's what my desire is to see those places, the places what Paul talked about, the regions beyond, or the not where Christ was named, lest we should build upon another man's foundation. That's my desire, is to get people to go that way. But if they're going to go, let's get them prepared for it and see if we can get this job done. So anyway, this week we're going to be talking about a little bit different thing. We're going to be talking about it's an introduction to what we call foundational Bible teaching. Now, in order to do that, let's go back a little bit in history to how this all got developed. Now, this is very specific and very unique within our organization. We're not the only ones teaching like this, but we're one of the few that really teach like this completely. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. Not trying to compare ourselves with anybody else, but I do want you to understand what we're trying to accomplish and why we take so much time doing what we do. So I'll go back with a little bit of history. Back in the 1970s, there was a missionary from Australia who went to the Philippines by the name of Trevor. And he went to work in an island in Palawan in the Philippines. And his job after he got there was he was going to go into an existing work where they had about 40 churches. And his job was to help build up the church so that the church would carry on the work of ministry into the other areas of the country. So as he was learning language and culture, he started noticing a problem, a disparity between what they believed and how they acted. And so there would be, they would go to church on Sundays, they'd sing, they'd give, they'd do all these different things. They had pastors and whatever in the church. But they also noticed that they went into their gardens, they still did their sorcery, they still did their witch doctor stuff. If somebody got sick, they may go to the missionary, but then they would also go to the sorcerer. Things like that, and wife beating, other things like that might be involved in that also. And so they got to wondering about, is there something going on here that I don't understand? And so what he did is he thought, well, maybe I need to talk about these particular issues. So he started teaching topically. It could be everything on husband-wife relationships, relationships with other people, about marriage, about purity. It could be about communion, whatever it was, whatever the subject, he was teaching about that. And he noticed that people's knowledge increased, but yet their actions still didn't really change. And so he thought, well, okay, maybe what I'm doing is I need to teach the Bible expositionally. Start at a book of the Bible and teach through it so that they can have the flow of that particular book. Once again, the knowledge increased, but really no real change in the lives. Everything was still pretty much the same. They were still trusting in their own works to get them to heaven. So he stepped back from that and was asking the Lord what the deal was, what's going on. And so the more he stepped back from that and started asking the Lord about it, what he noticed is that he, at least in his mind, he thought, maybe I'm making assumptions about what the people are understanding. It isn't what they're believing, it's what they're understanding that's the problem. And so what he did is he started stepping back and he thought, maybe what we're making assumptions about how they're understanding the end of the story without having developed the beginning of the story. And so what he did is he started at the beginning in Genesis 1 and started teaching some foundational stories in the Old Testament. And as he did, he noticed all of a sudden that the people's attitudes changed about how they viewed their world around them, everything, their relationships, nature, all kinds of different things. And he just noticed that they were really, really grasping what they were hearing, and they also started seeing they had problems. They recognized their own problems. And so what he ended up doing was eventually developed around 70 lessons, and what it was to do was to take people from the very beginning, in other words, teach the whole redemptive story. And so that's what he did. He came out of the tribe, was really excited about that, and started telling other people about what was going on. And some people said, wow, that's really, I know that the first time I heard, I couldn't believe we didn't get this before. But then other people said, wait a minute. If what you're saying is true, then what you're saying and what we're doing is wrong. And his point was not to say what people are doing is wrong. He says, just we need to be thinking through what we're doing and what the understanding of the people, because ultimately they're the ones that suffer the consequences of what we do. And so what he did is he started doing that. And some people really grasped onto it, others didn't. And the ones that did, they started taking it back. And this, we're not just talking about Philippines, we're talking about New Guinea, we're talking about in Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, South America. They started teaching like this, and the missionaries started noticing that the people's attitudes completely changed from what they were, and they started recognizing that they had no hope apart from the Redeemer that God promised would one day come. Well, so that's kind of how the whole thing got going, and as more and more of our tribal works were using this, especially in New Guinea and the Philippines and some in Indonesia, they just started, it became it did become really, this is the way we're going to do it, because we know it works. But because this isn't just a tribal principle or a country principle, it's a biblical principle. God started at the beginning, just like what we're doing. We didn't discover anything new. We just rediscovered what God had already done. And when I say we, I'm telling you that I don't take any credit for this at all. I'm building upon what other people have done before me. And I've been fortunate to know some of these people and seen what they've done and lived under them and learned from them, and they've taught us things. And so that's been very, very important. Now all I'm doing is trying to pass that on to others. That's what we're supposed to do. And the things that you've heard from me among many witnesses, the same commit to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. So anyway, and as a mission, we've really adopted this as a really effective way of doing it. We really just don't do it any other way anymore, because like I said before, ultimately it's the tribal people who suffer the consequences of our decisions, and that's what we want to remember. Now, it's not just another method. Like I said, it isn't just something like we can try this here and in another culture it's different, or another. We believe that God revealed this, in eternity past. He had this in his mind, what he wanted to do. And so God, remember, he's the one that created people. And he's the one that told the story, tells us this story. And this story is a redemptive revelation of who he is. God is telling us who he is by what he does. He doesn't just hand us a book of systematic theology and say one section's on justice, section's on mercy, another's on love, another's on this or that or man. We don't have all that. In other words, it's not systematic theology the way we think about it. I remember a man, his name was Lance Latham. He was the founder of Awana. He used to say this. He said, systematic theology is a man-made method whereby simple truth is made difficult. And I think there's a lot of truth sometimes in that. It isn't that there isn't a place for that, but I think in the beginning what we need to do is lay the proper foundations for that type of a teaching. But many times what we're doing is we're teaching material that's way down the road to people who aren't ready for it yet. We need to lay those foundations and build that up. So, and another thing we're doing is we're not just telling a story, we're not storying. I know that's a term that's used in missiology these days. It's not just storying. We're not just memorizing a series of stories and giving them to somebody and hand them off and saying, go tell people and we'll just figure that they'll get it. No, we're teaching. We're teaching people, but we're using a narrative form. But every story is a reflection of something about who God is, who we are, who Satan is. There are themes wrapped up in there. The best example I can use is you all know what a chocolate-covered cherry is, a cherry cordial. Some of you like them, some of you don't. I love them. I just love those things. And all I think of every time I see one of those chocolate-covered cherries, I look at that thing and I think, And I see that chocolate and I sit there and I want to bite into it. I'm always debating, should I pop the whole thing in my mouth and just bite down on it, let the juices run down on my jaw and it hurt and everything because it tastes so sweet? Or do I want to bite into it a little bit and then look at that cherry on the inside? I thought, that's good. But you know something about those chocolate-covered cherries? Whenever a person buys those, you know what they're buying it for, don't you? They're buying it for the cherry. Because anything other than that cherry is just a Hershey bar. And so they buy this chocolate-covered cherry, but they want what's inside, which is that cherry. And that cherry are the themes that are taught throughout God's Word. The chocolate is the story that theme is wrapped up in. So you start learning who God is by what he does. And it's a way of presenting God in a way that's not boring. God tells us a story. And in the same way, it's just like that cherry. It's a way of eating cherries in a way that's not boring. And so we pop cherry in, but we got that chocolate and that cream filling in there. Love it. That's one of my favorites. So anyway, I don't eat them very often because I know how much I like them. But they are kind of fun to eat once in a while. But that's kind of what it's like. God is wrapping up his themes, such as God is good, or God is great, or he is omnipotent, or all powerful, or he's just, or whatever. And he wraps all those up in stories. And those stories reveal who he is. It's just like when you talk about somebody, let's say how many of you know anybody that's a liar? Well, how do you know they're a liar? It's because they lie. And when you talk about them lying, you've got that lie wrapped up in an event. And the event reveals the person's nature and character. Or if they're honest, or if they're gracious, or kind, or mean, or whatever. All of those things are wrapped up in stories. And those stories tell us what the people are like. God's doing the same thing with us. He created us to learn a lot like that. But he isn't just telling us a story. He wants us to understand what's inside that story, the theme that's there. So, so anyway, but what we're not doing, like I say, we're not storying. We're not just giving people stories. And let me give you an example. And what the danger is if we do that. The people that we went to in Papua New Guinea knew all the Bible stories. I mean, they had religious organizations in there for decades, all kinds of religious groups. And so when they were in there, they were hearing all these stories. They were pulling it into their system and making it fit. I mean, they knew if you were to ask them a Bible story, they could almost repeat it to you verbatim. And you think, wow, these people really know God's talk. But as we started understanding language and culture better, we started figuring out what it is they truly understood and what they thought. And I'm going to give you an example. Our people thought that Jesus Christ was somebody who came right before World War II. And he came to the western ends of our islands into a tribe on the western end of our big island where we're there on the West New Britain. And when he came into that village, there was a big ceremonial dance going on at this wedding. And Christ got involved in this dance and did such a good job that all the women started to desire him. As a result, all the men got jealous, and they said, when he gets done, we're going to kill him. And so they waited for the dance to finish. Christ walked up, and when the dance was over, Christ left the village, went up on this volcanic mountain up there right by this village, and the men followed him up there, and then they killed him, and then they buried him. But they didn't bury him just any old way. They buried him perpendicular to the village, and that's what the symbol for the cross means. So now, that's how they were understanding the story. Why? Because they pulled the story into their cultural worldview, how they viewed things, and made it fit. So when they heard about the marriage feast of Cana, they thought, well, it must be like one of our marriage feasts, because it doesn't say a lot about what went on there other than Christ changing water to wine. Then they heard about the Mary and Martha and Mary Magdalene and other women ministering to Christ. And their thought was, why do our women hang around with a man? It's because they desire him. And why were the Pharisees jealous? Well, obviously it's because the women desire Christ. And then they heard about Golgotha and the Mount of Olives, and it just got all convoluted and messed up. So that's what we're trying to avoid. What we're trying to get them to understand is the true implications of what they're hearing. So that's what we're trying to do. So what is the purpose of foundational Bible teaching? The purpose is to lay proper foundations. When you build a house, you don't start with the roof. You start with the foundation. And then when you put the foundation in, then you start putting up the walls, the studs, and everything like that. Then you put up the rafters, and then you start putting on the siding on the house. Then you get the roof on, and the windows, and all the siding, and all these different things, building on the inside. But everything is built to a particular point where you can move in, then you just continue finishing it off. And that's kind of like what we're trying to do here. We're starting at the beginning. We want to build strong foundations so that we can build a proper biblical worldview. The goal is not to build just any old worldview, but see the world from God's perspective. So that's what we're trying to do. And we're also trying to correct faulty views about God and man also. Because that's the problem with a lot of us, is that we have faulty views about who God really is and who man really is. Years ago, there was a man by the name of Dave Breese, and he used to, from here in Kansas, and he wrote a book, and it was called His Infernal Majesty, and it was the subtitle was Satan's 10 Most Believable Lies. And I always remember one especially. He says Satan is one hundreds and thousands of people through witchcraft and sorcery and so on, but he's won billions through false doctrine. He doesn't care how close you get, just so long as you don't get there. And so that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to fill in gaps in understanding. A lot of people know some of the stories, and they may even be believers, but maybe they're struggling in their faith or struggling in areas where they wish they weren't. Well, this is part of what this is doing, is why is the world the way it is? Why do we die? Why do we get sick? Why do good people suffer? And why do the unrighteous prosper? And these are questions that need to be asked, but they need to be started at the beginning. This, why do marriages fail? Why do children turn out bad? This is all of the stuff that we need to talk about. My wife and I just earlier this afternoon watched that I Can Only Imagine, that movie. It's really, really a good movie. You would enjoy seeing that. But it gives that idea that it tells about a worldview, faulty worldviews that are corrected by a proper understanding of who God really is. And so I want to deal with that. So that's what we're trying to do. So what is the rationale for teaching the Bible this way? Well, there's a biblical basis for this. So I want to talk about, there's three of them, and I want to talk about this. One is, well, let me put it this way. The biblical basis for that is, I'll give you some examples. And one is in Matthew 13, verses 1 through 9, and 18 through 23. And I'm not going to read the verse right now, but I just want to talk about it. And it talks about the parable of the sower. Most of us know that story about the sower that went out to sow seed, and some fell on hard ground, some on stony, some on thorny, some on good ground. And then at a little bit later, the Lord in that same chapter, he explains what that means. What does this? What is he trying to explain? What is that story representing? What is it trying to tell us? And he makes a mention of there, and I want us to get this. In the first part, it says about the hard ground. It says, "This is he who hears the word, but does not understand it. Then the wicked one comes and takes what was sown in his heart." The good ground says, "This is he who hears the word, understands it, and brings forth much fruit." So the only difference between the two is one hears. Well, they both hear. One understands, the other one does not. Now, I ask farmers this all the time. You know what the difference between good ground and hard ground is? And they'll say, what? I says, about 6 inches. I says, it's the only difference. It says it's the same ground. The difference is one is prepared, the other one isn't. And see, a lot of times what we try to do is we try to plant seed without preparing the soil first. But no farmer in his right mind goes out and just throws seed everywhere. They spend an entire year preparing the ground, getting it ready so that it'll produce the greatest crop it possibly can. And that's what we're trying to do. We're going to take a long time doing what we're doing to prepare that ground so that you guys can understand this well. Now in John chapter 4, and that's the parable, I'm sorry, that's the scene where the woman at the well talks to Christ. He tells her all these different things. She runs into town. And during that time while he's sitting there talking with her, the disciples come up and they bring some food for him to eat. And after she leaves, the disciples say, "Rise, master, and eat." He says, "I have meat to eat that you don't know about." And they sit there and say, What does he mean? He says, has he already eaten? Has somebody given him something? And he says, no. He says, my meat. And what he means by that is my everything I live, eat, and breathe for is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. That's what Christ said his purpose was. And so then he goes on and he explains a little bit more. And then he comes to a little point there just a few verses later, and he says this. He says, don't say there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest. He says, behold, I tell you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white and ready for harvest. And the interesting thing is we've used that as missionaries many times as this is what we say, man, the field is white for harvest. We need to get out there. I want to take it. I don't think that's a correct interpretation of what it's saying. But let's go on here. I want to read to you here in Luke chapter 24, verses 25 through 27. And it says this. Then he said to them, I'm sorry. I'm back up a little bit. There's a couple of verses later, a few verses later, where after he says this about I have meat to eat that you know, or there are yet 4 months and then comes the harvest. A few verses later he says, listen, others have labored and you have entered into their labor. In other words, what he's telling them, he says, somebody else has already put in the hard work. They've plowed the ground, they've disked it, they've raked it, they've fertilized it, they've done all this stuff. That's what all the Old Testament is all about, is getting the ground ready for the planting of the seed. He says, others have labored, and you are entering into their labors. So that's what we're saying. Many of us, because we became, the reason I became a believer, and I didn't hear it this way that I'm going to teach you, is because somebody else had already given me a lot of information beforehand. It just didn't make sense to me. But then when it made sense, I had all that background already. Just like when John the Baptist said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That statement has 4,000 years of history backed up on it. So anyway, so in another event there, we're on the road to Emmaus. This is after the resurrection. He's walking to Emmaus. He's walking with these two guys, these disciples. They don't recognize who he is after the resurrection. He kind of hid their eyes so they didn't understand him. He's just conversing with them. So in Luke 24, verses 25 through 27, it says this. Then he said to them, and see, this is after he's been talking with them. He says, what's been going on? He says, don't you know anything? That's about what just happened, about how Jesus was supposed to have died and he was supposed to have risen again and all this stuff. And anyway, it says, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? And then he says this, and beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. See, he was talking to men who already had the background information. And he says, beginning at Moses, which is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and all the prophets, everything that came else in the Old Testament, he started telling them who he was as a result of that. And they realized finally who he was. So anyway, behold the Lamb of God. Like I said, that is a statement that has a lot of assumptions built into it. So when John the Baptist was proclaiming that, he was talking about Christ, but he was telling the people there, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And then in Matthew 7:24 through 27, we have that picture of the 2 houses that are being built, one on stone, one on sand. And he says, and then the winds and the sea comes and it blows one down, the other one stands firm. Why? Because it's built on a solid foundation. And so that's what we're trying to do, is help you to understand and be built on a solid foundation. I'm not saying you have to agree with everything I'm saying. All I'm saying is I'm just giving you some things to think about, for you to understand, to grasp and grapple with. Whether you agree with me or not is irrelevant, as long as you agree with the Lord. And that's the thing we want to be careful of, that I'm telling you this is mine, or somebody else really developed these, but they would never take credit for it either. It says they're not the ones that originated this. They said God did. God started at the beginning, and he spent a lot of time laying foundational truths through the Old Testament. Like I said, I didn't originate these lessons. Somebody else did. So that being said, next week start the lessons. So these first 3 lessons: who am I? What am I trying to accomplish? And the intro to foundational Bible teaching, what we're getting ready to do, starting at the beginning, laying foundational truths through the Old Testament first. That starts next week. Next week we'll be talking about the Bible being our authority, which is really, that's the main thing. And then after that really actually starts the lessons. But these 3 were really foundational to those. So in any event, I just want to say thank you so much for listening in. Remember, if you have a friend that you think would want to listen to this, have them tag me, or just tag them and tell them to look at me on my website. You can either go to tribalscheibel.com, or you can just go onto YouTube, type Doug Scheibel, and I'll have the information at the end of this video that can tell you where. And if you have an audio, you want to just listen to the audio, I'm also doing this in an audio podcast, and you can get your favorite podcast apps such as Apple Podcasts or Google Play Music or Castbox or Overcast, things like that, and just look up. Just look my name up, Doug Scheibel, again, and you'll get to the Premature Bible Institute. So anyway, I just want to say thanks so much for watching and listening, and thank you for everything you've done. You take care, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.